Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 64 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Philadelphia Flyers, in which the Sharks have lost 3-2. This was the second and final matchup between these two teams, and you'll remember that their first matchup this season was actually the Sharks' first win of the year, which would normally not be a particularly notable stat, but when you consider the fact that the Sharks started this season with 11 straight losses, being that first team to actually give up a victory to the completely helpless at the time San Jose Sharks was probably pretty embarrassing. And so you can imagine that the Philadelphia Flyers coming into this game were definitely looking to try and get some revenge against one of, if not the, worst team in the NHL at this point. On top of that, the Flyers are mired in an incredibly close playoff race, just barely managing to hold on to their third place spot in the Metropolitan Division. And so coming up to a game again against one of the worst teams in the league, you need to be able to get those 2 points. So definitely the deck was stacked against the San Jose Sharks. The Flyers with a ton more to play for than San Jose. This is pretty much going to be on theme for the rest of the season, or much of the rest of the season from a San Jose perspective, and yet the Sharks actually put up a pretty good fight here tonight. Definitely didn't let the Flyers walk all over them, and when it came to the even strength play, of which we didn't really get a ton of due to tons of penalty call, the even strength play was relatively even, and you could even make the argument that it was slightly Shark favored as well. In the first period, the Philadelphia Flyers would get the first goal of the game. This one would be on a breakaway from Joel Farabee to make it 1-0 Philadelphia, but the Sharks would answer back with a power play goal for themselves, coming from Filip Zadina to tie the game up at 1, and that would be the score at the end of the first period. In the second, the Flyers would take their lead back once again, also on the power play this time, coming from Morgan Frost to make it 2-1, but the Sharks, it's Zadina once more, tie it up 2-2 as we then head into the third period. There were definitely some worries right at the end of the second period, as this was perhaps the best period of play for the Flyers, and they had a ton of great chances within just the last few seconds of this middle frame, but the Sharks kept it tied. And then in the third period, while this one was not technically a power play goal, it was on a delayed penalty being taken by Fabian Zetterlund, and so the Flyers were in a 6-on-5 situation, coming from Tippett to make it 3-2 Philadelphia, and the Sharks could never close the gap for a third time. Even when it came down to a 6-on-5 situation, there just was not a lot doing there. And here's the thing you'll notice for San Jose over these last few games, they have been scoring, a couple of goals in each of these games, certainly not terrible, although not great, but the issue, if you could really call it that, is that most of these goals have been scored on the power play. Here tonight, 2 goals, both on the power play. The other day against the Ottawa Senators, 2 goals there, both on the power play once more, and in the game before that against the New York Islanders, 2 goals there. One of those was also on the power play, so 5 of the last 6 goals coming with the man advantage. Now, usually this would be a big issue, as for a team heading into the playoffs. As we know, there are a lot less penalties called in the playoffs, and so you don't get as many power play opportunities. So if you're relying heavily on your power play to win games, that's a strategy that definitely falters in the postseason. The Sharks are not going to be making it to the playoffs, so it's not necessarily the end of the world, but technically you are expected that the power play is going to fall back in line with sort of the average, and especially for San Jose, the average is relatively low. And so if the scoring from even strength doesn't improve with that, the Sharks could find themselves on the other end of many shutouts to end this season. But currently the power play is rolling enough to make these games relatively interesting to watch, and that's exactly what we saw here tonight for San Jose. And from a defensive standpoint, they did play rather well. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the top line of Zetterlund, Granlund, and Barabanov kept together for another game here tonight, and this was a relatively solid line for San Jose. I thought they played pretty well defensively as a group, as is kind of the general theme for most of the lines here tonight. They did have a couple of really close offensive chances. There was this one play that Zetterlund made, which was really, really good, coming through the neutral zone to then feed eventually for Barabanov, who came oh so close to actually scoring it past Urson, just like a toe save for the Flyers goaltender. And then there was another really close call earlier on in the game as well, created by Barabanov. So he actually had a somewhat standout performance performance, probably one of his better games of the season, which is really not saying much, but is, I guess, decent to see. I imagine if you're Barabanov, you probably would have hoped to have had those types of games prior to the trade deadline, but you never know what's going to happen in the offseason. Still a lot to play for number 94, and he had a solid game. The other two players on this line, besides that really nice play by Zetterlund, I felt as though they kind of lagged behind, in particular Mikael Granlund. Talking about players who don't necessarily have much to play for, Granlund didn't get moved at the trade deadline, which wasn't that much of a surprise considering he has 1 year left on his deal, and because he's not a free agent at the end of the season, he doesn't really have much to play for in that regard. So you're kind of having to find that motivation elsewhere, just general I want to win type of thing, and that's not necessarily the easiest thing to do when you're coming down to the final stretch of the season. So Granlund, perhaps not his best game of the year. Then we get to the second line where we have Kunin, Eklund, and Zadina. And obviously the first things first to mention here is that while this line was technically not together on the power play, both Zadina and Kunin did find themselves on the second power play unit, contributing directly to both of the goals for San Jose. Zadina being the one who actually scored them, while Kunin on both of these made the primary pass, has the primary assist. And these aren't just random passes. These were incredibly impressive passes by Luke Kunin, and also some really strong goals from Zadina. The second one, more of like a tip-in type of tap-in, not exactly the most difficult one to pull off, but the first goal was a really nice move on the Flyers goaltender, so a lot of credit does have to go to them in a power play situation. In fact, not only did Zadina have those 2 power play goals, he probably could have had like another couple power play goals on other chances for the San Jose Sharks, as I mentioned, I think the Sharks had 5 power plays here tonight, including a pretty short but still notable 5-on-3 opportunity there, or at least a 6-on-4 with a delayed penalty type of situation. And so when it comes to Zadina, a really great night with the extra man on the ice. From an even strength perspective, however, this line didn't really do much. Eklund, I thought, was decent enough defensively, which was nice to see, but from an offensive perspective, there really wasn't much there. And the same could be said for his wingers. While they had that amazing performance on the special team situation, the even strength, there wasn't really a ton doing. Then we get to the third line. This is where we have Sturm, Bordeleau, and Kostin, interestingly enough. In the previous game, it was Hoffman joining these two, and usually I have kind of felt the same way as David Quinn. I've agreed with David Quinn with a lot of the lineup changes that he has made when it comes to the more veteran type of players. When it comes to the younger players like Eklund or Bordeleau, we have our obvious disagreements, as that's just kind of like a philosophy thing. But when it comes to the older players, usually it's just, hey, did this guy play well? No. Drop him down the lineup, or even just out of the lineup entirely. And that we have kind of remained consistent in that regard. This is really one of the first times we've diverged. I really thought Hoffman was very good. I don't know if he was injured. That could definitely be a possibility, but if he was a healthy scratch, that to me is rather surprising, especially when you consider the fact that Klim Kostin really wasn't all that good in his debut game for San Jose, at least definitely not as good to get like a lineup promotion here for tonight, but he ends up on this third line at even strength. I thought they looked pretty good. To me, the standout player on the third line was actually Thomas Bordeleau once again here at even strength. He's probably having his best stint in the NHL since, he ever came into the NHL. He had a really strong first few games. I think it was like a couple of years ago at this point, so that's definitely notable. But here it just feels slightly different. He's making slightly more of the correct plays, especially in the offensive zone, which has been very nice to see. So I don't know if he'll be able to finish out the entirety of the regular season for San Jose. It's possible that the Sharks will want to get some other players up from the Barracuda, and maybe Bordeleau will end up being the odd man out in those types of situations. But if he continues to play like this, it's going to be hard to justify to remove him from the lineup. When it comes to these two other players, Kostin did have like one good shift, which I was impressed with, and also I thought his power play performance really was also quite solid. Not quite at the level of Kunin or Zadina, but still pretty good on the second power play unit. But otherwise, even strength-wise, not exactly doing a ton, and the same would go indeed for Nico Sturm, who I thought was a decent compliment for Bordeleau, but nothing much more than that. And then when it comes to the fourth line, we had Bailey Carpenter being rejoined by Giovanni Smith. Smith missed last game in favor of Kostin jumping into the lineup as the newest San Jose Shark, but with Hoffman coming out, Giovanni Smith instead of Kevin Labanc comes right back in, and he goes back to what we are kind of used to from Smith this season, which is pretty much nothing. This fourth line barely even had offensive zone time in this game, just not doing much, not doing particularly well for San Jose, and not much else to say about that. From a defensive standpoint, as I mentioned, the San Jose Sharks actually played at even strength a pretty solid defensive game outside of like that really dangerous stretch right at the end of the second period where things kind of fell apart and Flyers got a couple of really good chances. I thought the Sharks locked things down rather well. In fact, the Flyers were only credited with, I believe, 3 high danger chances at even strength for the entirety of this game. And that does start with the top pairing of Ferraro and Burrows, who I thought were rather strong for San Jose from a defensive standpoint here tonight. As I mentioned in my grading video the other day, when it comes to Mario Ferraro, usually the way he plays does coincide with how well the Sharks play. If Ferraro is playing well, the Sharks are likely going to look pretty good because of that, and that's exactly what happened here tonight. Ferraro had a solid enough defensive game, and as such, the Sharks had a solid enough defensive game, and credit does have to go to his partner as well, Kyle Burroughs, in this situation, who I thought was also quite good. Then when it comes to the second defensive unit, we have Vlasic and Thrun. So the good news, I thought these two players were good enough. For sure, when it comes to Henry Thrun, there weren't a ton of egregious mistakes, which is something that has been creeping up into his game as of late. The bad news, however, I would say, is that there were still a couple of positioning errors for both Thrun and Vlasic here tonight. A couple of times where they're beat along the boards, which is not exactly what you want to do when you are a defenseman in the NHL level. At the NHL level, just ask Calen Addison. And so they weren't outstanding for San Jose, but considering that the game generally was pretty solid, they kept up, and they were not bad, like, by any means. And then when it comes to the third defensive pairing, we have Addison and McDonald. I did just kind of like trash talk Addison slightly there, but he actually had an okay game. It's definitely above the level that we are usually expecting from Calen Addison. From an offensive standpoint, he did somewhat struggle. His power play performance here tonight, which he was getting on the first power play unit, by the way, did leave a bit to be desired. Really wasn't doing much in terms of power play quarterbacking in that situation. Jacob McDonald really wasn't all that much better on the second power play unit, but it was at least like a step above Calen Addison. But defensively, at even strength, I thought both of them were serviceable here tonight, which is pretty good for what you usually expect from them. And then when it finally comes to the goaltender, we have once again Magnus Krona getting the start. So still Mackenzie Blackwood remains on the sideline. There was a question of whether or not Devin Cooley, recently acquired at the trade deadline from the Buffalo Sabres, would actually get a start here tonight. That does not end up happening. Krona gets another opportunity, and he once again looks really good. He had a strong performance against the Ottawa Senators. He looked quite solid here tonight against the Philadelphia Flyers. None of these goals I would necessarily fault him too much for. The Frost one was off of a bounce that is somewhat difficult to predict. The Tippett goal is also a really tough one after a great pass from Konechny. That one should be cut off by the Sharks defensemen, who were just unable to get their sticks on that one. And then the Farabee one, while that is 5-hole, it doesn't look fantastic. It's also on a breakaway situation, so it's hard to put too much blame on your goaltender. But generally, Krona looking pretty good, which is nice that he's finally managed to string together 2 straight good games for himself. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday, where they'll be taking on the Pittsburgh Penguins. Reminder that the first time that these two teams met, the Penguins won by a score of 10-2, and so there's really the only place you can go from here is up when it comes to your performance against the Pittsburgh Penguins. But one thing to note about the Penguins is that they have been struggling as of late and have fallen down and almost completely out of the playoff race in the Eastern Conference, which is notable because of the fact that the Sharks actually have the first round draft pick for the Penguins this season. However, it is top 10 protected. What that means is that the Penguins will have the opportunity to keep the draft pick of this year and instead give them the draft pick of next year in 2025. And so the major question would be whether or not the Penguins would be willing to part with their draft pick if it ends up being 8th or 9th overall, or if they roll the dice on giving the Sharks their 2025 draft pick. And it's hard to imagine if a already kind of old and slightly washed up Penguins team is bad this year, how they could be any better next year. So it's going to be very interesting to watch what the Sharks actually end up getting out of this Erik Karlsson trade, as that first round pick was pretty much the centerpiece of the deal when it came to the future of the San Jose Sharks. And while this upcoming game versus Pittsburgh is not really going to be the end all be all of what ends up happening, it is just a note to keep an eye on this Penguins squad over the rest of this year and perhaps into next year as well. Class dismissed.